Erich, good to see
Hey,
you, my friend.
good to be on the show.
Yeah, and welcome to the virtual session and operations calling, Tulip's user conference 2023. Excited to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
This session, we're going to talk about driving digital transformation with an open ecosystem approach. So we have a heavy title to tackle here.
Not a problem. It's my wheelhouse.
Okay, excellent. And that's perfect because for those of you who don't know you, I will let you introduce yourself because I've known you for several years right now at this point, and you have evolved like from, building the Azure IoT offering all the way to leading standards for Microsoft and advanced manufacturing in industry. So tell us a little bit what you do at Microsoft today.
Sure. So I'm the chief architect for Standards Consortia and Industrial IoT. So I haven't really, left that behind. Industrial IoT is still my main area, my main product focus area. But I've pivoted a little bit towards representing Microsoft in consortia, driving standards into the broader Azure portfolio, not just Azure IoT, but the broader Azure portfolio of services. Also, obviously, helping the community and helping, open source initiatives where people are looking for reference implementations to bring, standards into products. And I mean, you need references if you want to be successful bringing those standards into your products. And we're doing a lot of work there now through GitHub, of course, through the OPC Foundation, through the Digital Twin Consortium. So I think last year alone, we contributed over 2 million source lines of code for those kind of initiatives. So open source is also an important part of my job.
So before we dive into the topics that we spent most of our time on and are most interesting for the audience, Microsoft has the past several years went through an incredible transformation led by Satya. I'm sure you all read the book Hit Refresh, and it's so phenomenal. Maybe broadly speaking, like what's the view today from your perspective on the importance of ecosystems in general? Like why do we have to have an open ecosystem? Why is that so critical for innovation and for actually implementing all this, plethora of new technologies that drive our organizations to do basically everything?
Yeah, so since Satya took over, there were two pivotal moments where I realized something significant has changed at Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was when he gave a presentation to the Linux Foundation and he had a slide where it said, Microsoft loves Linux, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was just tectonic, earth-shattering moment, right? And I realized, wow, this guy is serious, right? And then the second major moment for me was, well, of course, we bought GitHub, which I also thought was super important. But when the .NET team decided to open source .NET and make it cross-platform, I went, wow, okay, so we are actually serious about this, right? So then I took that kind of change in strategy as a excuse to pivot our manufacturing strategy around 4 pillars: open source, open standards, an open platform, as in the Azure platform, and open data models. Open data models is probably the most important thing because before that, we just made up our own data models, right? And thought nothing of it and thought, well, yeah, we had to pick something, so we made it up. But realizing that creating a product around an open data model, preferably a standard data model, is such a differentiator because it doesn't lock customers in to your proprietary walled garden, but opens it up for everybody to collaborate on. I think that has been the most important change for us and our manufacturing strategy. And since then, I've been driving that initiative, that, strategy.
Yeah. My take on it before we dive into industrial really deep is that same moment you're talking about it's almost Microsoft stepping up and saying, we know what developers need for the next few decades going forward. And, I've always thought about Microsoft as a developer first company. When you think about it, like all the tooling, the operating systems, the frameworks, now obviously with the cloud era that we're deep in it.
They're just answer to that. I would put 2 twists on that. One is we didn't say we know what our customers want. we went from a know-it-all to a learn-it-all company. So we said, we want to learn and continue to learn what our customers want. So that's been a big strategic difference. We no longer want to be the people who knew best, but the people who are willing to listen and to learn continuously and never stop learning, right? Because things change and things you knew yesterday might no longer apply. So
the open sourcing of .NET, like to think that you're going to deploy large-scale B2B infrastructure using some closed source, something that one company controls. I mean, it just feels very awkward in the day and age we live in. So that's mostly what I'm referring to.
Yeah, and I think that totally changed. And from a how do we see ourselves? I would say we see ourselves as a platform company, right?
Yeah.
So it's no longer, of course, we have end products that usually build on top of the platform. I mean, a lot of our services, a lot of our end products run on Azure, right? But it's mainly that platform thinking. And again, developers obviously also need a platform to build their apps on. So yes, we're a developer-focused company with Visual Studio, with GitHub, and so on. But I would say, if I had to pick one, it'll be we're a platform.
That's good. So how does that apply to operations and in industrial applications and in the new architectures that we're seeing emerging? So it's been very clear the past, I want to say, at least 5 years, where we have seen, while continued use of, say, classic protocols, from your SCADAs and your field buses to I would argue the maturity of OPC UA and MQTT and de facto crowning them as standards for the operational arena. But they don't live in a void. Some people call this unified namespace. Some people have different names to it. What are you seeing in the architectures on the shop floor that needs to support smart factories? And what is Microsoft take on it? And where do you see the future of such architectures?
It's interesting. I still remember the field bus wars, and it wasn't a very happy time especially for end users, right? That were locked into a single.
I mean, it was good for system integrators.
Right. System integrators had a lot of work to do. Let's put it this way, right?
Yeah.
But when it comes to cleaning that up, and I mean, people say, oh, the field bus wars are over, OPC UA is the answer. I think it goes beyond that. I think it's more than just cleaning up the field bus mess, but also focusing on the higher levels of the ISO 95 pyramid, the application level. And then also, obviously, new is kind of the edge / IT level, right, which sits on top. That OPC UA has really taken over and established itself as the IEC standard to use. And I mean, you can't do without the underlying protocols, preferably also standard protocols, because obviously, if you're using something proprietary on top of the standard, the whole thing is proprietary, right? So it's got to be standards all the way, right? So that's why OPC UA for cloud and edge communication picked MQTT. We actually picked two. So at the time, we didn't know who was going to win out. So it was AMQP and MQTT. Turned out MQTT won out, right?
What were the main factors, at the time? You didn't know that you said, this is what we're going to do.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually me who said, originally it was just going to be AMQP. They said, no, we have to have MQTT in there as well, right? So I pushed for it to be, so this is part 14 of the OPC UA spec, and I said, we need to go out day one with MQTT and MQP. So that's what we did. Nowadays, I also see Kafka being used quite a lot. So I propose that, we'll, also create a so-called protocol binding for Kafka, but that doesn't really matter. The main thing is that you need to base your communication stack on standards. That gives you interoperability, and interoperability gives you scale, right? Because anybody can build a proof of concept that works with a single machine and a single dashboard in the cloud. Where it gets hairy is once you start scaling that thing to all your sites across different continents. That's when you really need to be able to have a scalable architecture, and standards help you in a huge way there because of the interoperability they provide.
And what's interesting, and maybe you can talk to that a little bit. One of the most exciting developments I'm seeing, and I think we're still in the early days, is the evolution of the UA cloud library. Can you speak a little bit about that? What are the benefits?
Sure.
Why is that important? Of course, we at Tulip, we obviously run on Azure infrastructure and support several of the services, like from MQTT and OPC UA all the way to the cognitive services and OpenAI. But this interoperability we're still seeking, I think this initiative is very critical. So can you cover that in a few minutes?
Sure. So one last sentence regarding the edge and, the cloud and how that communication happens. So I mentioned MQTT. We finally have an MQTT V5 broker in the cloud with Event Grid, right? We finally have a Kubernetes-based fault-tolerant edge offering, in fact, both on server-class hardware and PC-class hardware. The Azure Kubernetes services for the edge.
Yes.
So those two things kind of round up that whole picture, that whole interoperability story. And then the cloud library is really a necessity for us because we realized, sending the data in OPC UA PubSub format is all well and good, but you really have to refer back to the original data model that the asset, it could be a machine node, it could be a historian.
Yep.
There's really
could be anything.
Limitation there. Could be anything. Just let's call it an asset that you have that you want to make use of in your digital operations, right? And you have to have that data model available to you, right, at your fingertips. So we realized there isn't anything out there. So, I suggested together with Sesame that we build one, and UA Cloud Library was the result. We built it over the last few years. It's been very successful. Sesame has built it into their smart manufacturing innovation platform. We use it obviously on Azure. Lots of customers use it. It's cross-platform. It runs on any cloud, not just Azure. And we contribute the whole thing open source to the OPC Foundation. You can run it yourself if you want to. And it's an online store of OPC UA information models.
What's your favorite success story with a customer that bought into this, new way of, putting your data models and containerizing and putting it as a cloud-based set of resources for the enterprise that you can share?
There's a few. I'm just coming off the automotive conference here in Munich, actually this week, where I was on the panel with BMW. BMW is a great success story of ours, so we're very happy with that collaboration. There are several others that, in different, oil and gas, food and beverage, anybody really these days, are all Fortune 500 companies use Azure to some extent or another. In terms of specifically, using containerized technology, using our reference architecture, actually Tulip is a great example, right? We've been working with Tulip for years and years and years, and I know you're using Azure, you're using all our containers.
Yep.
So that's been a fantastic collaboration that I'd just like to highlight.
Thank you.
And there's many others. We have joint customers, of course.
So what's interesting, I think and that's what we started to see, because obviously we're being a frontline operation platform focused on enabling the people who, design, build, run, operate operational environment labs, assembly floors, machine shops, and so on. But really, it extends much further, right? Because all this contextualized data that those operational environments are generating, and granted, once they sit in standardized, data models that can be easily communicated via standard protocols that the community actually owns, and the infrastructure providers support through, core services that are not, they're not end-of-lifing them every year or so. So there's a true commitment. It really goes beyond and opens the door to a new architecture for the supply chain.
Right.
What are your thoughts, and how does Microsoft see the broader picture?
Yeah,
how does that impact organizations?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, because there's actually a similar shift to what we've seen with OPC UA on the shop floor currently happening in the supply chain. It's not as far ahead, I would say, as OPC UA. I mean, it's a done deal, right? But on supply chain, we're starting to see emerging standards like, for example, the asset administration shelf and the platform industry 4.0. And I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg. Sometimes I get the feeling everybody's waiting on everybody else to kind of make the first move. We made the first move by saying, okay, here's a reference implementation of the asset admin shell. You could host it on Azure. But again, you could also host it on other clouds, but of course we focused on Azure. We contributed the whole thing to the Digital Twin Consortium, open source, so it's not really a secret. But of course, we integrated it with our analytics services like Azure Data Explorer, so people could see how the data could be retrieved. And of course, you can also host OPC UA information in there, right? Mm-hmm. So some of the benefits of using OPC UA to send data to the cloud is it comes with rich metadata, and of course, then you can model your asset admin shell from the metadata from your assets. And for things like product carbon footprint calculation, which is actually going to be mandated in Europe through the Digital Product Passport, that includes product carbon footprint information. So if you're doing business selling your products in Europe,
you probably need it.
You better start reading up on this stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because sooner or later you will have to supply it. And I mean, automotive manufacturers have that very much on their radar. I can tell you that for nothing. And I mean, that's going to be super critical because, I mean, if you think about an automotive manufacturer, how many tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers they have, if they all send product carbon footprint information for the parts, every nut and bolt on the car will have some sort of product carbon footprint information. If they all send that in different formats,
that's it.
They make up themselves.
We'll have no parts,
right? You won't be able to do it, right? Yeah. And that's just part of it. I mean, the supply chain product carbon footprint is about 90% of the total carbon footprint of manufactured goods. So it's a huge amount, but obviously you also need to calculate your own product carbon footprint during production, right? So it's mainly an energy measurement task, which is relatively easy, but it's got to be done. OPC UA can help there too, but supply chain is where the bulk of the carbon footprint comes from. And you have to have a single format, otherwise you're going to go crazy. And that's where the asset admin can really help. So hopefully this will become a widespread. So SESME is beginning to adopt it as well. They're part of the Manufacturing X initiative that the European Commission started, and I made sure of that. And we'll see some progress there as well. And hopefully we'll get a single global standard and not every government coming up with their own. That would be disaster as well, because let's face it, most of these products are sold worldwide, and if we had a single standard for something like product carbon footprint, hugely improve efficiencies and cost saving.
I totally agree. And I think the good news is that when you look at the adoption curves of OPC UA and MQTT, this is where I draw a lot of encouragement, because the adoption of these core open protocols really sort of have a resemblance to the way HTTP and then REST and then WebSockets and all those things that we take for granted. And no government said like you have to use WebSocket, but de facto it has become standards, and obviously with all the security layers and all that kind of stuff. So in a way, my summary hearing your update, which is very exciting, is that it's almost like we're moving from the buzzword age to the future is here and now. 5 years have passed. The architectures and the blueprints are out there, and they're open, and you can click on them. We're going to include in the session a bunch of the links, from the cloud OPC UA, so people can see this great work that you're doing with Microsoft and SESME. What do you see in the future? So obviously we've been collaborating and working very closely on this idea of a frontline operations copilot to help people in platforms like Tulip, build applications faster, process their data, and have this sort of in-platform assistant that allows them to achieve a lot of the mundane tasks. But it feels like the AI component and the machine learning component that actually underlying, it's not all about just the generative AI. It's also about the deep learning aspect. Let's not forget a decade of deep learning that actually enabled us to do all these kind of things. So
exactly.
What's your take? Like where's that future?
I mean, people have a strange view on what, this new AI wave really is, right? I mean, I always think of it as like you said, an assistant for mundane tasks, something that you needed to do to get the job done that you now can load off to a machine, which is obviously trained to do the job. Otherwise, you're not going to be happy with the results. But you train the machine, you train the model, and then the machine takes over a mundane task, so you can focus on more valuable work, say. But it's not like the machine's going to take over your job. Your job is just going to change, right, to the better, quite frankly. I mean, we've had great successes with copilots for like Office is an obvious one, for GitHub, you know, writing code, coming up with answers. I mean, nowadays when I do a, you know, Bing search, the copilot answer that pops up automatically is usually much quicker to just read that than try to read every link that you get and to even understand my question properly. You know, and with the copilot, you just save yourself so much time. And it's very similar in the manufacturing space where, you know, I can think of lots of different scenarios where, you know, you have a mundane task ahead of you where you could think, well, would a copilot experience help in this case? So you can get that mundane task out of the way to really add value for all the other tasks that you still have to do, right? So asset onboarding was a great example where, you know, asset onboarding, nobody likes asset onboarding. It's a mundane task. It requires reading PDFs, typing in tag names and, you know, register addresses and, you know, byte codes. And it's just a very, very unforgiving task as well. If you make a mistake, it won't work, right? So yeah, the copilot experience for asset onboarding, and, you know, we're working with that with Siemens. You know, that would really help and get value from the data. I mean, you're not doing asset onboarding and the whole industrial connectivity for the sake of it. You're doing it to get to the value added stuff later on, the analytics of the data, and, you know, using machine learning, some of the classic machine learning, you know, like deep learning, you mentioned deep learning, to do analytics for you, right? I mean, you can't get to that stage if you're not collecting the data yet.
Exactly.
For that kind of tasks, I think OpenAI is made for it. But don't forget, you know, computer vision, you know, for quality inspection, you know, deep learning for data analytics, finding, you know, predictions, finding anomalies. All of that still applies too, and we shouldn't forget about that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we got basically a technology with so many practical application that my take or my twist and your characterization is we got back a lot of time. It's giving us a lot of time, and it's an interaction modality that changes how we combine search with getting some tangible result out of it, whether it would be like to build a no-code app or to create your analytics comparing, you know, line 1 and line 4, or whether it's you know, you just mentioned the deep learning example with vision and so on. It's like it used to be that it would take months to set up those pipelines, like to get the data and labeling and only then publish the model, run it, and so on. And doing that in a matter of sometimes days and sometimes hours is just phenomenal, and it's been going really fast. Yeah. And my view is like building it, again, the same sort of open ecosystem approach that is exactly building on those data models and their definitions, because that's what makes OpenAI very repeatable and useful with its drawbacks. You know, we all are very well aware of the drawbacks and why we need a human in the loop, which is clearly, you know, doesn't really exist.
Yeah. I mean, I always say, don't forget to keep your brain turned on when you're using it like that, right? So you still need to validate the result. That's why, like you mentioned, we have a human in the loop to validate what the AI service came up with. And that will not change, right? So you always have to have that validation step before you end up using the results in your production process or whatever it may be.
And on that note, while OpenAI gave us a lot of time, we are now out of time. But
as usual, time always flies when I talk to you.
Yeah, it's been great, and I think the future is exciting. We're looking at awesome open architectures, protocol stacks, data models, but all those architectures will still have humans driving them and keeping the human in the loop. That's a really good takeaway to end this conversation. So Erich, thank you so much for coming to Operations Calling virtual session. And as I mentioned, we'll include all the links and continue the conversation online, and we'll see you again very, very soon. Thanks a lot.
Appreciate it. Thank you.